Okay, a very warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen. For those who are seated at the back, feel free to step forward to the front. We got like almost two empty tables here, so feel free to step forward. All right, no worries about that. All right, and we are very privileged to have two distinguished speakers today for this particular breakout. All right, so this breakout is about revamping cultural and social institutions to engage new cultural identities. And I have here with me today two distinguished speakers, Professor Farish Noor, right, who is a political scientist and historian, right, whose work focuses on colonial Southeast Asia, and he is currently based at the Faculty of Social Science, Universitas Islam International Indonesia, UII. And we also have Dr. Caroline Tseung-Wong, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Canberra, Australia, and she is I believe, a native of Mauritius, right? And she's going to share with us some of her work in the island of Mauritius. And her research expertise is on the cultural identities, intergroup relations, and well-being in culturally diverse contexts. So let me just briefly begin by this breakout, to share with you a little bit about what this breakout is all about, when you talk about revamping cultural and social institutions to engage new cultural identities. I think after 1.5 days of conference, I think all of us could kind of agree that we kind of live in a very volatile, very unpredictable environment today. Right? It's not just because of the geopolitics, but also because we are going through a lot of changes in our environment. Digitization is one, we have new rituals, we have new social norms, and we're also trying to navigate between, sort of like at the in-between of different universe, if you like, right? The one that many of us are familiar with before COVID, and the new sets of norms or practices that were kind of inspired or triggered by the pandemic and also the transformation, the digital transformations. And more importantly too, I think we have also seen how the rest of the world change and evolve politically, socially, economically, right? And I think we are seeing a lot of new dynamics, not just in terms of the sectarian tensions, but also very much in terms of what may be some of the new practices that we embrace, and also new tribal identities, if you like. We used to, at least in Singapore context, we used to look at racial relations, racial dynamics in the context of Chinese, Malays, and Indians. These are the largest brackets. But increasingly, right, I think we're also looking at new forms of identities that are very hyphenated, very, if you like, bespoke, right, if I may use the word. So what do they mean, and what does it, when we look forward in the next 10, 20 years, what can we anticipate? So I think those are topics that we'd like to discuss today in this particular breakout. And we have two speakers with us who will share with us some of their perspective, their thoughts. So we have Caroline to go first, and then followed by Farish. And they will spend about 15 to 18, 20 minutes to share with us some of the work. And then we'll open up the floor for Q&A. All right? So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Caroline to go to the podium and to give us her thoughts. Caroline, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. I would like first to thank the organizers for the chance to participate and learn from others in this conference, and hopefully my talk will provide some food for thought. I was born in Mauritius as a third-generation Chinese Hakka Mauritian, and I grew up speaking Creole at home and French at school. I do not speak Hakka. You can blame my parents for that one. I did not have to question my ethnic identity until I went to university in the UK, because there I had to negotiate how others viewed me. Asian-looking, but speaking French, so not quite. Mostly westernized, but not looking it, so not quite either. My children are 1.5 generation Australians of Chinese Mauritian descent, so also not quite. These many not quite, but richly good enough parts of our cultural identities have been fertile ground for thinking about and studying multicultural identities. Yuri Bronfenbrenner, a developmental psychologist, argued that an individual's development takes place within nested systems of influence, from more central and immediate, what he termed the microsystem, so think family, neighborhoods, to more peripheral, the macrosystem, so societal norms, policies, global events, which nevertheless trickles down to the individual and their sense of who am I and where do I belong. And listening to the plenary session this morning, I wonder where the digital space would fit in those nested systems. And perhaps they are both a macro and a micro system. So yesterday and this morning's social cohesion talk, addressed social cohesion and diversity ideologies at that macro system level. In this talk, I want to focus on the individual level of analysis and zoom in on individual sense of belonging, living in culturally diverse settings, and the role of that macro system societal norms on our cultural identities. I draw from two contrasting societal contexts to inform the reflection on new cultural clusters or new cultural identities. One, the most densely populated multicultural country in Africa, Mauritius, and two, migrants from settled countries such as Australia and the US. So in a nutshell, but really in a nutshell, Mauritius is a small, insular Indian Ocean island state with no indigenous population, colonized in succession by the Dutch, French, and lastly British. The early history of Mauritius is one of sugarcane plantations, French settlers, and enslaved individuals from Madagascar and the east coast of Africa. The British abolished slavery, and Indian indentured laborers, Hindus and Muslims, were brought in to work in the plantations. A small Chinese community, mainly Hakkas, settled, mostly as traders, and set up corner shops. The ethnic composition of Mauritius to this day is made up of Hindus, Muslims, Creoles, Franco-Mauritians, and Chinese Mauritians. The majority Hindus rose from poor indentured laborers to drivers of independence in 1968, and then on to dominate the political and public spheres. According to the anthropologist Aidan Law, to maintain their majority position, Hindus strategically promote links to the homeland, or to the imaginary homeland, as he calls it, Mother India, by keeping alive ancestral traditions, cultures, and languages. Muslims also benefit from such a representation of the nation as they can draw from the Ummah. However, it is difficult for Creoles who face a higher level of economic hardship and social prejudice to find their place in this dominant discourse of cultural homeland because many of them are multi-ethnic descendants of slaves. Mauritius, therefore, provides a social context of static cultural diversity, facing emigration rather than immigration. James Mead, a Nobel Prize winner of economics, predicted that after independence, Mauritius had the recipe for a bleak future. Ethnically diverse, densely populated, sugar-dependent. And yet, it is the A-star student in Africa for economic markers, and of interest today, ranked as very high on the Positive Peace Index 2024 by the Institute for Economics and Peace, and was recently chosen as a case study for the Sustaining Peace Project at Columbia University. Mauritius, therefore, by and large, is considered a peaceful multi-ethnic society. So one learning that we're going to consider today from Mauritius is to look at the social representation of the nation by its citizens, and two, the corresponding compatibility between their ethnic and national identities. Diversity in Mauritius, to paraphrase Billig, takes the form of banal multiculturalism, where symbols of differences abound in the landscape and permeate their everyday life. There are public holidays related to each ethno-religious group. So as a case in point, Chinese Mauritians make up approximately 3% of the population, but Chinese New Year is a public holiday and celebrated by most. There are religious and sacred places anywhere, and different languages on radio and TV. But these ordinary instances serve as reminders that diversity is who we are, and thereby normalize differences. They are so different to us is viewed in terms of we are all different. Interestingly, there's no official policy of multiculturalism like in Canada or Australia. Instead, and I think importantly, multiculturalism, the recognition and celebration of cultural diversity, is lived multiculturalism, homegrown or organic, as Farish said this morning. Because of a small geographical space, Mauritians interact across ethnic lines daily in public transport, the workplace, schools, and getting along, and there's a specific Creole term for this called la corité, is viewed as essential for the functioning of a society. And this is akin, and this is how respondents described peace in Mauritius in the Sustaining Peace Project, an everyday peace. In our research, we found that endorsement of multiculturalism was high for adolescents across ethnic groups, so Hindus, Muslims, and Creoles. And this endorsement of multiculturalism was stronger for those who reported a stronger national identification. It seems that those with a strong sense of national belonging were in favor of that national ideal of multiculturalism. And this social norm of recognition of cultural diversity conveys the message, this is who we are, and this is what we do. So in a large survey with 2,190 Mauritian adolescents, aged between 11 and 19, we asked them in an open-ended question, what makes a person Mauritian? So we obtained 17 categories that could be clustered in 3 main groups. Under feeling Mauritian, so pride, group respect, belonging. Being Mauritian, so factual criteria, being born in Mauritius, residing there. And doing Mauritian, so speaking Creole, participating in Mauritian way of life that includes specific cultural and religious practices, dancing the sega. Importantly, the most frequently mentioned criterion by the participants, independent of their ethnic group, was the need to respect, care for, and tolerate other Mauritians, and that one should not discriminate between ethnic and religious groups. In the words of one respondent, a Mauritian is a person who knows different cultures and also lives between all of his cultures. A person, for instance, being a Hindu, will not only celebrate his festivals, but also celebrate the Muslims, Catholics, and so on, like Noel, Christmas. And the more strongly the national identification of the adolescents, the more likely they were to define the Mauritian national group membership based on that feeling category, so caring for others, group respect. This representation of the national category as diverse and tolerant can be viewed as an enabler of compatible ethnic and national identities. The correlation between ethnic and national identification was significant and positive across the age groups and across the ethnic groups. On the Moreno question, which is this question that we can see here, which asks participants how they predominantly feel towards 2 groups, in this case, the ethnic and national group. Again, across ethnic groups, adolescents were more likely to choose the dual identity, both national and ethnic category. The same Moreno question has been asked to adults in the Afrobarometer survey, so different series of the Afrobarometer survey, and again, with the adults, dual identity is the category most chosen by all three ethnic groups. So what can be learned then from Mauritius about cultural identities? When the social representation of the nation is about cultural diversity and getting along across ethnic lines, then these social norms trickle down to the individual's sense of who am I and where do I belong? And their ethnic and national identities can both be positive, compatible, and accepted. The questioning, but really, where are you really from, becomes ecologically invalid. However, this question is probably familiar to visible minorities living in settler countries, to which I will now turn to. Settler countries such as the US, Canada, and Australia, and especially their big cities, receive migrants from all parts of the world, making them not just diverse, but as Vertovec argued, super diverse. In these countries, there's usually a clear mainstream group which provides the reference norm for different domains of life, from politics to education to social policies to economic markers. Ethnic minorities or migrants, especially those who may be more culturally distant from the mainstream, then have to manage and negotiate the being, doing, and knowing of both their cultural group and the dominant mainstream society. One positive outcome of this negotiation of one's cultural identities is to have what we call a consolidated bicultural identity, an integrated and holistic bicultural. As, for example, being a Chinese American, not as a Chinese plus an American, but simply a Chinese American. Importantly, the ways in which these cultural identities, ethnic and national, are managed influence whether they would be viewed as consolidated or conflicted. In our research, we proposed two processes by which individuals can manage their ethnic and national identities. One, a hybrid identity style, which is denoted by picking and choosing desirable elements of two or more cultures, so that one can consider themselves, for example, as Chinese in an Australian way. And an alternating identity style, denoted by shifting cultural identities dependent on the particular social context, so that one can alternate between being Indian and an American depending on the circumstances. These identity styles have been validated in different countries, New Zealand, Mauritius, Australia, and the US. And in settler countries, the hybrid identity style has been consistently linked to having a consolidated bicultural identity. In other words, when individuals process their ethnic and national identities in a hybrid way, they are more likely to report a consolidated and an integrated bicultural identity, which then is associated with more positive well-being. However, the alternating identity style has been associated with cultural identity conflict, illustrated by questions such as, I find it hard to maintain my cultural values in everyday life. It seems, therefore, that the two identity styles, hybrid and alternating, are linked to differential outcomes, with the hybrid style associated with the more consolidated bicultural identity, and directly with more life satisfaction and psychological well-being. What are the factors that are conducive to that hybrid identity style? Across studies, we found that age was linked to hybrid identity style, so that older participants were more likely to score higher, probably because they have had more time to think about and integrate their ethnic and national identities. But age is just a small part of the story. We also investigated contextual variables, such as the perceived diversity norms of the country. In Australia, amongst a group of non-British migrants, we found that perceiving that the majority of Australians think that life is more pleasant in Australia when various ethnic groups keep the cultural lifestyles alive was linked to both hybrid and alternating identity styles, but only the hybrid style was associated with a consolidated bicultural identity. In the US, with Chinese Americans, we explored the criteria that Colleen Ward talked about yesterday, the 3 criteria of multiculturalism, that is multicultural contact, the ideology of multiculturalism, and the policies and practices. And we found that multicultural contact was associated with more hybrid identity style and onto more bicultural identity consolidation. What can we conclude from studying ethnic and national identities in different countries? For one, first, social context matters, and specifically the societal norms prevailing in the country. In Mauritius, where the representation of the nation is one of cultural diversity and getting along, ethnic and national identities were viewed as compatible and dual identity as the preferred option, because everyone is one type of hyphenated Mauritian. In settler countries, where a mainstream exists, individuals of migrant or minority background had the challenge of negotiating their ethnic and national identities, and so far, it looks like when they pick and choose elements of the 2 cultures and blend them in a manner which suits them, the outcomes are more positive. But this is not a given. The influencing variables are many and complex, but if they perceive the societal context to allow for the existence of cultural groups, this is a good start. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. I think this is a very fascinating presentation. You actually covered many different locations, Mauritius, US, as well as Australia, and you've given us a bit of the context, a snapshot of the different multicultural societies. So next off, we have Professor Farish Noor, right, and he'll share with us his take, right, on hybrid identity. Farish.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the presentation before that, so I'll try to dovetail some of the points. I'd like to do 2 things. I'd like to, one, go back in time. I'm supposed to be a historian after all. And then I want to project forward ahead and look at the question of identity in the context of representation in complex societies today, particularly pertaining to the younger generation. Multiculturalism has been the buzzword for the last 48 hours, and a lot of us have been using it to discuss something that is really complex. But I think it's also important, because we're having this discussion in Singapore, in Southeast Asia, to remember that it's also an idea that, in a sense, has been introduced to this region through processes that are historical. And it is, from a historian's point of view, impossible to disassociate or decouple, multiculturalism from the experience of colonialism in the past. So I need to start with that. Because in a sense, that's where multiculturalism enters the domain of public discussion in Southeast Asia. It's during the colonial period. And we have to remember that, as I said in the earlier panel, the experience of colonization in Southeast Asia is not homogeneous. There were very, very different modalities of colonial rule at work, whether it's in British Burma, British Malaya, the Strait settlements, the Dutch East Indies, French Indochina, Spanish, and then later American Philippines. But one thing that all of these colonies had in common was that they came under colonial rule at a time when we witnessed the rise of modern racialized colonial capitalism. You cannot deny that. That's part and parcel of our history, whether we like it or not. Now, during that time, that's when you alluded to the census, for instance. Yeah, that's when we begin to see the invention of difference. Difference is introduced under the auspices of colonial rule because all the colonies of Southeast Asia, with the exception perhaps of Thailand, Siam, were made plural complex societies through deliberate policies of migration and settlement in order to create ethnically diverse societies that were functional, where different groups were given different roles within the economy. So, and I'm sure in the case of Mauritius, it was like that. I mean, you talked about the sugar industry. So different ethnic groups are given different appointed roles in the colonial economy. And from there emerges this almost idyllic idea of a happy colonial space where there is diversity and difference. But this was always a managed diversity. It's a managed diversity, and this is where my concern lies, because, and this has come up in several of our panels, when we talk about multiculturalism, if and when multiculturalism becomes a thing that needs to be managed, then it moves into the domain of bureaucracy and technocracy and governance. And so this is where the history of multiculturalism needs to be traced back to. And from this, of course, in the post-colonial era, many, perhaps all states of Southeast Asia are built on the foundations of colonies. And this colonizing mindset remains at work in the way in which, until today, we perpetuate these categories of difference, identity and difference, and the way in which we maintain distinctions along basically ethno-racial lines and religious lines in some cases as well. Now, that in itself, I mean, that's just mundane history. That's just things happening over time, no big deal. It becomes an issue when today, as we've seen over the last 2 days, then emerges this idea that somehow this multiculturalism is either under threat, or it's waning, or there's less support for it, or people are finding it problematic. And I would argue that there are a number of reasons why this is the case. And again, to go back to Carolyn's presentation, the very positive picture we see in Mauritius, partly, as you say, it's, I think, partly because there has emerged already this idea that Mauritius is a complex country. So that complexity is the starting point. Many post-colonial states in Southeast Asia also started off with that. Indonesia, for example, with its doctrine, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, the unity and diversity, the acceptance from the outset that we are not homogeneous societies. And so there has to be a representation of different voices, different types of identity. Now, again, I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with that, although, of course, that again means that multiculturalism is a thing to be managed and guided and policed and basically, plodded along to make sure it goes down its path. However, developments have overtaken events, and I think this is where suddenly now, all over the world, multiculturalism seems to be beating a retreat. And why is that? It's not as if we all woke up one day and sort of had a hangover with multiculturalism, or we ate something wrong the night before and suddenly we've lost our appetite for multiculturalism. That hasn't happened. What has happened are actual changes to the political economy that has basically brought about changes in the way identities are formed, maintained, and how new identities also emerge. I'll give you a very simple example: youth culture. Yeah? Of course, there have been young people throughout human history, right? But youth culture is actually something relatively new. Yeah? If you go back and you dig through your grandparents' photo albums, you'll notice one thing. Up to the 1950s, kids and adults dressed exactly the same way. Yeah? Boys were basically miniatures of their fathers and grandfathers. Girls were miniatures of their mothers and grandmothers. He dressed the same way. Post-World War II, in the boom years, someone had the bright idea, hey, let's make more money and invent kids' fashion, which of course parents will be paying for, right? So now suddenly kids have an identity. Kids have an identity. It's like the concept of children's rights. For a very long time, it was perfectly all right to throw a child into a coal mine and get them working, because nobody thought that was an issue until someone comes up with the idea that, hang on, maybe these miniature human beings are actually human beings with rights, and then we should stop exploiting children. That one idea, it's a nominal construct, but it actually changes things like labor relations and modes of production. So youth culture emerges, and with youth culture emerges a host of other things. Pop music, pop culture, youth TV, everything that we now take for granted, all of which are relatively new. They're actually very new. Yep. So in the context of that, we start seeing new categories of identity that the traditional state that emerged from the jello mold of the colony was not designed to administer. It doesn't know what to do with this. Yeah? So how do we deal with this? And I think here is where, if and when we see tensions arising and when we see voices clamoring for identity and recognition, it's because the state may actually be blind to the fact that these new identities exist and are calling for recognition. So then this becomes a dialectics between society and the state. When segments of society feel that they, now endowed with an identity of their own, demand representation. A very good example, and again, I speak as a historian, if you look at the histories of Southeast Asia, yeah, the official histories of Southeast Asia, what happens after the 1940s when one by one the states of Southeast Asia become independent states is nationalist historians write their national histories. That's not a bad thing, yeah? Because, of course, if you put yourself, in the 1940s, the spirit of the time, you have succeeded in state capture, you now have the state, you will write your history. So Indonesia writes the history of Indonesia, Malaysia writes the history of Malaysia, Vietnam writes the history of Vietnam. Nothing terribly wrong with that per se, but these are statist histories. These are state histories written through the lens of a kind of official perspective of the way things ought to be. One thing these statist histories have in common is that they're all masculine histories. If you read post-colonial history of Southeast Asia, it's as if women don't exist. So suddenly one morning women sprouted like mushrooms because they were never in history. They're not historical actors and agents. But over time, with the advancements we have in society, and I would say it is an advancement, once you have things like women's rights, it is only fair and just, I believe, that there ought to be a representation of women in official national historical narratives. And that's the sort of debate that we are seeing in Southeast Asia today. Communities that feel, yes, we want to be part of the national story. We want to be both national and ethnic, national and religious. We want that, but you are not giving us space. We are not represented. We don't see ourselves. I was asked this question once by a student years ago who asked me when I started teaching history, she asked me, why am I not in the history books? Where do I find myself in the history books? And the only answer I could give her is that that's why you need to become a historian yourself, so that one day you will write that history, right? And that's the process that we are looking at. Now that process at an academic level is of course mundane and dreary, like all academic things, but once it's translated into politics and political processes, and once it manifests itself in terms of NGOs, movements, organizations, parties, then becomes political contestation. And I think until today, unless and until post-colonial states understand their entanglement, whether they like it or not, their entanglement with the colonial past and the structures of colonialism, they cannot address this problem. And so something is required at this point. So here we were back to the theme. How do states today deal with hybrid identities? And having to deal with hybrid identities, up to maybe 20 years ago, was already challenging as it is. It means reconfiguring what the nation is, who constitutes the nation, who belongs to the nation, who is in and who is out. And national narratives try to be as inclusive as they can, but often there are built-in biases. And I'm sorry, there's also a gender bias here, yeah? I mean, like I said, women are often not represented in history, but also certain ethnic groups, certain religious groups that are not part of the national story you want to tell to yourself. Now, here's the danger. It reminds me, I think Balzac said this, talking about Parisians. Oh, Paris, you know, Paris, Parisians who live in Paris, talk about Paris, are in Paris, are among only Parisians. So it's this echo chamber of just, you know, the national discourse, because a bunch of self-satisfied technocrats think that they've come up with the perfect national story, which may sound nice to them, but which doesn't resonate with significant sections of the national public. Now that's the challenge we face. How do we accommodate that? And that's already tough as it is. Now to complicate things even further, while this process of rejigging, rewiring the state so that it becomes open to nuance and complexity. I mean, states don't deal with complexity very well. It's not the fault of the state. All states are like this. A state is an apparatus that does certain things. It cannot do other things, but it's good at some things. But for states to take on board radical contingency, radical alterity, complexity, is not an easy thing to do, because the imperative of the state is always to simplify, to manage, to simplify, to manage, to simplify, to manage. Now, if that's not difficult, and if that's not bad enough, events over the last 20 years have complicated things further, because we now live in the age of post-industrial capitalism, post-manufacturing capitalism, and of course, and this has been discussed at length already, you know, we live in the age of social media. Now, with the age of social media, one vital section, and I'm very interested by the results when you interviewed young people, yeah? Because from my cursory experience with young people, I'm a teacher, so I'm with young people all the time, yeah? And having taught in Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Philippines, my experience with young Southeast Asians today is slightly different. In fact, not slightly, very different, very different. A number of things. Young people are a nation of themselves, of their own. Yeah? My daughters belong to a nation called Generation Z, right? And this generation, it's not their fault. It's not their fault. This younger generation did not invent Facebook. I know the guy who invented Facebook. It's not them, yeah? They did not invent TikTok, they did not invent Facebook, they did not invent Instagram, but they were brought up on that, and that is their world. Now, one of the questions that you raised in your slides is, where are you? Where do you locate yourself? Well, here it is. Here, let me put this to you. One question that bugs me a lot is, as a Southeast Asian scholar, teaching Southeast Asians in Southeast Asia, is, where are my students? I mean, of course, sometimes they're late for class, but I know they're outside. But you know, where are they conceptually, emotionally, mentally? Where are my students? For 15 years, I taught a course called State, Society, and Politics of Southeast Asia. Every time I teach this course, on the first lesson, I have one thing to do. I tell my class, everyone, and my students are from all over Southeast Asia, I tell all my students, okay, even if it kills you, turn off your handphone. Now close your laptop. Now take out this amazing piece of technology called a pen. And take out this other amazing piece of technology called a blank sheet of paper. Now, draw me a map of Southeast Asia. 15 years I taught this course, and not a single Southeast Asian student could draw me a map of Southeast Asia. But they can draw me a map of Middle Earth. They can tell me how to get from the Shire to Mordor. They can draw me a map of Westeros. Yeah? But they can't draw me a map of Southeast Asia. So back to the question that you posed, where are you? Right? Where are you? An entire generation of young Southeast Asians are physically in Southeast Asia, but mentally, emotionally, cognitively somewhere else. And they belong to this space in the cloud that somehow the state now has to touch and connect with. And the issues and concerns, the aspirations of this entire generation, I believe, are real and ought to be addressed by the state. But my question is, can the state, this thing that emerged post-Westphalia, deal with such issues? Yeah? And to go back to our earlier session, this is why when we talk about social cohesion and resilience, we now understand states can't do this alone. States cannot do this alone. They need to engage, and they need to engage at all levels. And this requires engagement with the young as thinking, rational subjects. Whatever anxieties that they are going through, and I think we are really witnessing an entire generation, wallowing in anxiety that is not of their own manufacture. They are the victims of it. This generation, I believe, requires representation and is actually clamoring to be part of this national space. But they are coming from a point of origin very different from ours. We belong to the Star Trek generation. Yeah? I think many of us here. We belong to the Star Trek generation where Star Trek was not a violent program. It's about discovery and newness and encountering difference. My kids and my students don't watch Star Trek. They watch zombie holocaust and nuclear apocalypse. And I mean, just go through your Netflix tonight. There's nothing but doom, and death, and a loss of faith in the state, a loss of faith in ideology, a loss of faith in economy. And that is the only reality that they are familiar with from their early teens. These are rational thinking human beings endowed with the same agency as we are, but who have been provided a very different vocabulary. So if I can dovetail your presentation earlier, the fact that these people can make that choice, when you give them a question, are you Mauritian or are you your ethnic group? That question makes sense because the vocabulary you've given them is a vocabulary that they're familiar with. Yeah? That's the vocabulary we have. That's the vocabulary our generation had. I'm not sure whether that's the same vocabulary that millions of young people and millions of young Southeast Asians have. They may have that, but they also have other vocabularies, other sense of attachments, other sense of identity and meaning and purpose, which the state is perhaps not even fully aware of. I mean, even now, we are only scratching the surface of social media. There's much more going on in there that we have no idea. You go deep enough, you'll find a Balrog, It's really the mines of Moria down there. You don't know what's in this space. And yet, that's where a significant number of Southeast Asians live, as pointed out earlier. Southeast Asia is a region that is the biggest consumer and user of social media in the world. Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand, if I'm not mistaken, more than 8 hours a day. Yeah, if I'm not mistaken. And Malaysia and Singapore, not that far behind. So that's where many of our Southeast Asians are living. Physically, their bodies are here. Emotionally, mentally, cognitively, they're somewhere else. They're in this other space. Now, the challenge for the state, therefore, is if the state is going to address this and deal with complexity and hybridity in society, is the state, as it is presently constituted, a tool that can actually deal with this? Are we expecting a hammer to perform brain surgery? Yeah? And if it's not the tool, are there other tools as well that we can use? And that's why I think our session earlier was important. We recognize this now. States alone cannot do this. States alone cannot do this. It requires engagement at vertical and horizontal levels. So, so basically, like I said, I just wanted to dovetail the presentation earlier. I found the findings very interesting because in so many ways, it's actually very different from my own experience in this part of the world. But I do think that since the theme of this entire conference is social cohesion and resilience, and I'm a believer that resilience has to come organically from society, I think we need to also start from the premise that society as we know it today, that traditional idea of society, so fashionable in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, that idea has exploded now. We're talking about societies. Now, how do we map out this new landscape? Before we even address the problem of how do we navigate these and how do we accommodate these voices and identities, we need to actually map it out. In the past, as pointed out earlier, the conventional understanding of multiculturalism was simple. You fall back on basically colonial praxis. You fall back on identities that are defined through very crude instruments like the ethnic census or the religious census or the racial census. These instruments are utterly useless today. I mean, they still work in macro terms. I'm not denying that they work in macro terms. And for economic planning, of course, they're very useful, right? But if you want to do more nuanced analysis and to anticipate issues and problems and concerns that arise in the future, particularly when it relates to the politics of representation, things like these census do not take us very far anymore. But we don't have the new tools. We don't have the new tools. And so the very fact that the survey was done for me is extremely important, because this is the beginning of that search for what's the next path, what's the next tool that we are going to use, yeah? And so on that, sorry, I'm a historian. I don't ever invite historians to parties because we are not happy people. But I think it's important to, like I said, understand where this discussion is coming from and where we want to take it. And so to sum up, one, we need to understand that multiculturalism has never been a neutral term. It has historical connotations. It has entanglements with power and with states. And two, as a tool, as a conceptual tool to understand what we are seeing now, I think it's also beginning to show its limits. If you're going to understand complexity in society purely in terms of multiple cultures, and cultures understood in terms of ethnicities and religions and races, that's not going to work, right? So there are multiple identities, but these identities are not only understood in terms of ethnicity or religion. Now, the next step would be, well, we've got 40 minutes, so we can come up with a new theorem and we can all collectively win the next Nobel Prize. But I think this is something that we really seriously need to sit down and talk about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farish. I really appreciate this. This is very insightful. And honestly, I learned a lot from hearing both speakers, the different areas that you cover. Caroline, you talk about the different types of hybrid identities, and Farish, you talk about the how that has emerged. And I really like the first part. You talk about the racialized capitalism. I mean, that completely encapsulates that whole dynamics in Southeast Asia on how multiculturalism even evolved in the first place. I see the questions are flooding in, but I want to reserve my right as the moderator to pose one question of my own to both speakers. And this is me after hearing both of you talk. Farish, you talk about this, how times have changed and Star Trek and all of that, and how it used to be like in the past, whether it's about kids' fashion and whatnot, and how that kind of emerged over time. And Caroline, you talk about this hybrid identity and alternating identities, and how people with the different forms of identities, how to manifest the behaviors, their emotions, and their motivations to engage people who are different or different culture. I'm just thinking aloud, if there is another sort of missing component behind all of the discussion, and that is the idea of agency, and that applies to both of you, right? I mean, the fact that in the 1940s and the post-Second World War, the boomers and the Gen X, I mean, if you look at the context, I mean, that whole idea of agency is somewhat different, as in, the state probably has a lot more influence in how identity is expressed, or preserved. And as individuals, you don't have so much option then compared to now. With the arrival of social media, you're able to express it differently. You're able to, embrace different forms of your personal as well as your social identities. So I just want to know, from both of you, right? To what extent has the concept of agency actually driving, that formation of hybrid identities and the articulation of that? And Caroline, going back to you, I mean, you talk about the hybrid versus the alternative identities. And again, I just cannot help but to wonder to what extent is that a function of an option that you have? And again, going back to the idea of agency, that if you happen to live in an environment where, that preservation and expression of your ethno-cultural identity is not quite encouraged. And consequently, the alternative may be the better way to do it as opposed to embracing the hybrid. So going back to the whole idea, how much agency, how much ability that you can influence, right, your personal way of life, so to speak. Anyone?
So I'll try to answer the question on that a sense of agency that you talked about. It's true that we said that there are two styles that people can choose, so the hybrid or the alternating. And I think there are two variables that might influence which one is more available to the individual or not. I talked more about that societal context, right? Some, like you've said, some societal contexts would probably allow more for the expression of one compared to the other. But there's also another variable, which I haven't talked about today, is linked to that concept of agency, is the individual's motivation to integrate, right? And that comes from the individual, whether they want to integrate those identities or not. And I guess one limitation of what I'm talking about today, and that links to the point that you made, Farish, is we are limited by our methods, in the sense that I've talked only about ethnic and national identity, but it doesn't mean that we only have those two identities. There are intersections of identities, gender, regional areas that we come from, yes, ethnic, yes, national. But for the sake of clarity, and maybe the methodologists in the room could help me, but we haven't found a way of how do we actually measure it. So when you look at that Moreno question that I put up, it only allows for either one or both, or more one or the other. But it becomes more complicated when you have to ask someone, how about this one, or being a girl living in a rural area, and you're ethnic and you're national, and it becomes more complicated in a quantitative way. But in a qualitative way, when you do interviews, I think you will get that nuance that is actually more the life of, well, my Gen Z children, I should say, right? It's more complex, but it's, I think we are a bit limited in a way in our quantitative methods of actually capturing this, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Yeah.
I think related to agency again, there's agency and there's also the moment when you realize you have agency. And I think that's the shift, right? That's the shift. We've always had agency, but the realization that people have agency, and with that agency comes rights, the right to question, the right to demand, the right to ask. You talk about preservation just now, so I'll give an example. Museums. Museums, one generation ago, were basically seen as the depository of the national identity. The state provides a service. The state plays its pastoral role as custodian of national identity. So you have a state museum, they put things together, some coffee pots or linen or whatever, and say, this is your culture, this is your history. We go, wow, yes, I know who I am now. That's okay for our parents' generation. Young people these days don't do that. They walk into a museum and say, colonial heritage, theft, racist, right? And that's good. That's good. Right? Because it means that there is engagement for the first time. Now, in the same way that states don't know what to do because they've never expected these questions, museums don't know what to do, art galleries don't know what to do, cinemas don't know what to do, teachers don't know what to do. I mean, our generation, you know why there's that long 1 meter ruler in the class? It's for your face, yeah? It's not for the board. It's when you ask a question, the teacher can't answer, pam, Nobody would dare do that nowadays, right? So that agency, now, so it's the realization of agency. Now, the problem with that, it's not really a problem, but the issue with that is there's the discovery of agency, and then also there's the promotion of agency, because we live in a kind of Fukuyama late industrial capitalist world where an entire market with its hegemonic discourse is also preaching this idea that everyone is a citizen/consumer with agency of choice. So in the same way that you're encouraged to choose things to buy, apps to download, and whatever, this promotion. So there's a kind of hyperinflation of agency, in fact. And this is actually very difficult for traditional state apparatuses, east or west, north or south, to deal with, because they've never had to do that. States have never had to be that accountable. Accountability is once every 5 years, right? Not on an hourly basis, you know, especially now on Instagram, it's minute by minute basis. And there's never been a time when politicians are called into account instantaneously, right? You know, one tweet and 10 million tweets back, you know, that's never happened. And I think that is actually interesting to watch. And again, like I said, the state, the traditional state as we understand it, is not designed to deal with that. It was never designed to deal with that. So that's where we are now.
Thank you. I think that's very, very interesting. I have here a few questions, but I think this is one where I think both speakers may be interested to give us your feedback. And this is from Kat. Right, so this is about, and both of you talk about youth, right? Caroline, you talk about your research with adolescents, and Farish, you talk about your own experience with your students and, you know, the kind of antics that they pull out. So we have a completely different generation of young people in this part of the world, probably the rest of the world, right? Who kind of maybe living in their own universe one way or the other. So how, from your opinion, what would be some of the ways that we can do to bring them back, you know, physically in, and to kind of, how do we initiate them and bring them back to another, well, maybe another universe or our universe where you have a more genuine discussions and get them back to the classroom, so to speak? Caroline, Farish.
I think I'm ever the optimist, so I do have a different take on that, in the sense that yes, young people are more connected nowadays. They have social media, and that's one mediator, if we might say, or one cultural tool that they use to communicate with each other. But at the same time, at least I see it where I live, they're still grounded in the space where they live, in the sense that the school that they live, the sporting activities that they do, the local footy team that they go for, it's still the real world. And I think in this morning talk, they were talking about giving a handshake and saying hello. Maybe it's a different context, but we shouldn't go to the extreme of thinking that young people don't want to connect. I do think they still want to physically connect with others and have friends. They just have a different way of mediating it or even communicating it, which sometimes I don't understand, but that's because I'm not young, let's put it this way. But it doesn't mean that we need to like pull them back. And we can't pull them back to the ways that we manage or talk to each other, because they have another way of doing it. They have a different way of doing it, but it doesn't mean that ours was a better way. It's just a different way. And the balance, and that's where I think that's the challenge of our world. There is diversity, but there's also that balance of commonality and distinctiveness, but also communicating in the real world, but also mediated by whatever they have on their phone.
I agree that, you know, there should not. I think we should not be nostalgic, you know, and say like, you know, it wouldn't be great if, you know, we sort of bring them back to the good old days in the 1950s. It was a horrible time, for heaven's sakes. You know, schools in my generation were like prison camps. You know, I don't want to go back to that. I mean, I don't want to go back to that. And I'm glad. I'm glad that young people are questioning. I'm glad that young people are asking questions and responding. I'm glad that they are not passive, whether it's at the cinema or watching Netflix or going to the museum, that they're not passive. So I don't think that young people are out there like they've drifted off. I think young people are actually the pioneers. I think the other ones are actually pushing the limits of human experience today. That's not the issue for me. The point is, if we take that as the premise, if we see these innovations and these new identities as being at the forefront of an expanding understanding of society, then the role of the state that has always been traditionally to manage society becomes more complex, because your society is expanding and it's morphing in different directions. And that's where, again, the onus is on technocrats and policymakers and the state to understand this, yeah? But this idea that somehow, here is where maybe I disagree with you, because the stats that we see in many developing countries is that young people are dating less. Young people are going out less. Young people are finding it harder to have face-to-face conversations with one another. And COVID, for instance, has been devastating. In Southeast Asia, one Southeast Asian country in particular had the longest COVID lockdown, 3 years. Yeah? And when I was in that country teaching, my colleagues told me, you have to be prepared for one thing. Our students don't look at us in the face anymore, because for 3 years, they were all stuck at home staring at their phones. They've forgotten the ability to look at each other face to face. That is alarming. But they are communicating and interacting through social media, yeah, in the realm of games and what have you. Now, whether that's good or bad, that's, I think that's depending on where we're coming from. However, this idea that somehow the younger generation are like frivolous and carefree is also, I think, not true. Certainly in my experience in higher education, younger people are far more depressed than I am. I thought I was depressed, but my students are far more anxious and depressed and worried about the future than I am. I belong to an optimistic generation. Remember, Star Trek, we believe in science, we believe in discovery. Young people now are expecting the zombie apocalypse tomorrow, right? And they are absolutely certain that their futures will be worse than their parents. They're absolutely certain they will never own a house. They'll never be able to afford a mortgage. So in a sense, I've said this many times, the younger generation is actually older than us. The younger generation is older than us because every young generation inherits the pessimism of the earlier generation, amplified and multiplied. So in so many ways, when I see young people, my concern is the loss of faith. So back to your question then, yeah? How do we bring them? Remember, we're looking at the survey findings, the loss of trust. And my biggest concern is when an entire younger generation has less belief in the state. If you look back again in history, the French Revolution was started by young people. Camille Desmoulins was executed at 27. Robespierre in his early 30s. Danton in his early 30s. They were young. Young people brought about change because you believe in change, you believe in the state. If you look at the history of anti-colonialism in Southeast Asia, all the movements were young. They were in their 20s. These were 20-year-olds who took on the might of the biggest empires in the world. 20-year-olds today don't believe they can get to tomorrow morning, right? And it's not their fault. It's because, if you've been fed nothing but a steady diet of pessimism and gloom and a negative prognosis from your early teens, that's the only vocabulary that you have. So the challenge for the state is, yeah, like you said, how to bring them in. What can the state do? The state cannot make us love each other. The state cannot force a society to emerge, but it can provide things like the opportunity structures and the vocabularies of belonging, of having a place. And when young people say, we want a place, that's where the state has to step in and says, we will give you a place. I'm so happy that at this event, we see so many young activists here. And that's a move in the right direction, yeah? There's been such a long tendency in our part of the world, right? If you're young, i.e. below 45, shut up, right? Because, let the adults do the work. That's changing. That's already changing because we know that every election in Southeast Asia over the last 2 decades has witnessed the same thing. Young people are becoming key players in the political process. That means, back to agency, we now recognize that they have agency. And that's a step in the right direction.
Interesting. Thank you, Farish. I have 2 questions here, one for Caroline and one for Farish. Maybe I'll start with Caroline first. And it's good that you talk about the vocabulary because this question is also about vocabulary. And it's about the vocabulary of, if you like, integration, right, for you, right? So, so far we've been talking about narratives and, what you expect in terms of a hybrid identity or alternate identities, and how, or what would the expectations of living together in a multicultural society. So this is a part where I'm not sure whether if, in the context for Caroline, right, because you talk about the ethnic and the national identity component being one that is mutually reinforcing. They are not, they're complementary. They are not replacing. They're not cancelling off one another. But have there been any instances where, when you probe and dive into that conversation, you are in fact looking at a set of vocabulary that doesn't align to one another? For example, when you say, people, want to engage, different adolescents, different communities want to engage one another, but it is in fact, it's a more like a receptive audience. So in other words, in a multicultural society like Australia, for example, the whole idea of integration may in fact have a very different meaning, so to speak.
Yes, and I guess that's where we talk about social context and the different contexts. Sorry, I'm just reading the question again here. I think different vocabularies should exist, because if we say that we want to align vocabularies, then we want one narrative. And if we want one narrative, then there's going to be just one way of being and doing. And this ship has sailed in a way. Like we're too diverse in a lot of countries to say that we want to align our vocabularies. What I think we might need to increase the richness of our conversations, as the question asks, is not really to align vocabularies, but to allow for the existence of different ways of seeing those vocabularies. So that, yes, we talked about generational differences, and there is, because growing up in the 70s is really not the same thing as growing up in the 2000s, and that's a reality, right? So if we're trying to align vocabularies, then we're saying, then we're going to have almost like a game of whose vocabulary is better than the other, and I don't think that's the point of it. To align it with that idea of, yes, I talk about hybrid identity, a way of processing identities in a hybrid way or an alternating way. At the beginning, there's no theoretical, if I might say, or even conceptual reason why one should be better than the other. Because sometimes in some contexts, it might make sense strategically to alternate, so to be more Chinese at home and then to be more Australian at work, because this is the norm and this is how we can manage our different spaces. But at the same time, being able, though, providing the context for people to be able to pick and choose, and that's the sense of agency again that we talked about earlier, is a good social context to have, and it's a challenging social context to have, because if we allow people to be different things, then we don't really have one version of that nation state that some people maybe have tried to build, right? And in social psych, there's one part that says that the more complex a society is, then the less group or one group could claim to be the typical member of that nation. And I think that makes sense. So if I wouldn't say there's like a receptive audience, like the question said, and I wouldn't promote aligning vocabularies. I think we should allow people to be not quite and good enough, because those different vocabularies would allow for people different expression. And the more you allow people to be able to express their identity or identities, or even sometimes their conflicted identities, the more positive they can allow themselves to be, because you are allowing for that diversity.
Thank you. Farish, the benefit of having a historian here is we can go back, we can have the discussion that traces all the way back, not just to the colonial era, but also potentially to the dinosaur era. So this is a question for you, all right? And no, not that you're a dinosaur. Right, so this is a question for you, right? And this is about expanding narratives, right? I think we've been talking about different sets of narratives, how that has evolved over time. And again, because of the complexity, it's getting a lot harder to get a grip, and of course for the state to manage that. So the question is, right? So is there a scope to expand the national narratives to encompass potentially infinite number of cross-cutting categories? Be that on relating to race, religion, or any other thing else, right? And how does that, kind of allow us to fit in to have a cogent understanding of who we are, where we are today, where we're going to be, right, in terms of the future, right, of the narrative. Because if you have so many different forms, whether you call it hybrid identity or you have a different complex systems, to organize different communities. I mean, where do we go from here, right? So as a historian, I'm just wondering, like, how do you see, us moving forward in the next 20, 30, 40 years, given that this whole catalog, if you like, to classify different eras, different periods, how is it going to evolve? What do you think?
God Save the Queen and her fascist regime. Sex Pistols, right? The most British, un-British thing you can imagine, right? I mean, that's the point. That's why punk was great, yeah? It's so contrarian, so anti-establishment, and so British and so English at the same time. It's nothing more English to me than Sex Pistols, right? So now, can the state take that into account? Like I said, this is not a diatribe against technocrats, yeah? Because I had one foot in that world as well. I understand. A technocrat has a job to do. There's this thing called society. I have to engineer equity for society. So I do my mathematical formula. Everyone gets X out of Y, equality. But in that society, there are people who say, hang on, my subject position is this, I'm this class, I'm this ethnic background, I'm this, it's not the same, we are not, and that's always going to be the tension. States can only think in terms of abstract universals, universal citizenship, which is not a bad thing, yeah? I'm an advocate of citizenship. But complex citizenship is something states don't know what to do with. No state. East or west, north or south, because the state was not designed to do that. So in answer to the question of infinite identities will always be evolving and multiple. They will always be, and all the time, right now, all of us, we are not schizophrenic, but all of us have multiple identities. As I'm talking to you now, I'm also a school teacher, a husband, a father. I'm not going crazy, I can actually balance all these things in my mind because they do not pose an existential threat somehow. It's not as if the moment I become a father, I stop being a teacher. It's like, oh my God, I have to stop teaching now. So, but states can't do that. And states don't know how to do that because they're not designed for that. So perhaps, again, we go back to understanding what a state is, how the state came about. Our states are post-colonial states. This is the structure, the skeleton that we inherited, and then we put our flesh to it and we built something out of it. It's a work in progress. Of course, I think in terms of the proliferation of identities and multiple identities and the intersectionalities that you talked about earlier, right? This will persist and multiply and amplify even further. Yeah. The challenge faced by all states all over the world now is how do we adjust, the modalities of what we do, because we have to do what we have to do, but how do we adjust this to the new shifting reality that is fluid? The point is that, and this is where history does matter, because there have also been times, when you go back in the past, where you see that some states, some polities were able to do this, because you have a very fluid sense of, laissez-faire, that you don't have to introduce this kind of Napoleonic moment where you arrest the state and freeze it forever. Yeah? When you do that, the state becomes ossified. It becomes a relic. It becomes a museum. And then it becomes irrelevant. And so again, back to the survey findings, I'm happy to see the horizontal linkages growing, stronger, robust, thriving. I'm worried about the weakening of the vertical cleavages because, remember, When you're dealing with a state, like I said earlier, you don't wake up in the morning and say, good morning state, good morning National Health Service, good morning National Postal System. You don't do that because these are abstract things. We cannot have a human relationship with an abstract thing like a state. To humanize the state is impossible, but we need the state as a tool. As long as we understand what the state is, what it can do, what it cannot do, then I think we are on better ground. But this phenomenon, this emergence and proliferation of identities is already the reality and will remain. So states better wise up. So behind the state, of course, are actual individuals, yeah, are people, yeah. And so if you're lucky and you have people who hopefully may be trained in the humanities, a bit slightly more liberal in terms of persuasion and the way they look at the world, will be able to understand that we need to change, we need to evolve. I think there's a growing understanding in our part of the world that the way we managed our societies in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, that's done, that's over. Yeah? And so we need to adjust to the new realities. But in the process of adjusting to these new realities, for heaven's sakes, listen to these people. These are people who are not demanding something unreasonable. Yeah? To demand representation is not an unreasonable demand. To demand or plead to have representation in the official narrative of the state or the official history of the nation is not an unreasonable demand. It's not saying, oh, all these people, now they want to be in the history books. That makes for a richer society. That makes for a richer history. And I think at least in the humanities, we've gone past that. We now understand that. History is never history, it's histories. Society is never society, it's societies. But state is still state, and so, yeah.
Okay, good. I have one question here, which I think apply to both of you, and it kind of brings us back to the focus of today's, or rather this conference, which is how do you foster connections, bonding, cohesion? And essentially, this is from Nick, right? So what is the best solution to have a cohesive society, whether by adopting hybrid cultural identities or embracing new cultural identities altogether? So the whole point is we know the cultural landscape, the social landscape has evolved and things are changing, and you have, categories or identities that are more complex. It's harder to classify. So how do you forge that bonding between communities, different communities, societies, right? In the midst of all those changes, what would be some of the ways that you think will be useful moving forward, in trying to reach out to people who may have a different view of how social identities are organized? This is from Nick. Right. Best solution to build a cohesive society, whether it's by adopting hybrid cultural identities or new cultural identities. Farish.
Okay, I'd like to address this, but I'd like to add one caveat at the beginning. Underlying this entire discussion so far has been, I think, the assumption that somehow embracing diversity is a good thing. And generally, it is good. However, it's an important caveat. I don't think you should make it compulsory to accept everything. You must have the right to reserve your judgment. I mean, okay, someone might say, okay, this is my cultural praxis. Well, if your cultural praxis, means, boiling kittens, for breakfast or whatever, sorry, I don't accept. I do not accept. I do not accept. I must have that right. And that does not make me a racist. It does not make me a bigot. It does not make me a chauvinist. So my concern, and one of the reasons why it's so easy for conservatives to smash and dump on multiculturalists is always this straw man figure, that, oh, multiculturalism, celebrating everything, all lovey-dovey, hippie, Woodstock and all that, which is not the case. It does not mean we must have that. So you have to build societies, therefore, where we also learn to disagree. I respect you, but I cannot accept this thing. I will not accept it. Yeah? But it doesn't diminish my respect for you, and it doesn't diminish my regard for you as a fellow citizen. So these are, I think, some of the ground rules that sometimes we forget, because that's the only way for me that we can get this discussion going. Because otherwise, if you're expecting universal acceptance, unconditional, that is, I think, setting a target that's a bit too high. Yeah? And it is in the long run difficult to sustain and dangerous to sustain, because it can lead us in directions that later on might be nasty. So I think that would be the thing. I don't think there is a solution. I think, one, it's learning from the school of hard knocks. So the answer, okay, what can states do? A very good example was given yesterday by President Tarman. Playgrounds, for heaven's sakes. Because it's in the playground that you play. It's also in the playground that, you know, you tease each other, you joke each other, but eventually you become friends. Yeah. Talk about, you know, schools in the politically incorrect era where I grew up, right? Where bullying was, of course, horrible, nasty jokes, boys' school, what to expect, yeah? But those friendships last until now because a familiarity has developed over time. If everything becomes a taboo subject, and there are too many lines that you cannot cross, then I think our ability as a complex society to be collectively introspective and self-critical is also diminished as a result. That might not take us where, you know, to a good place in the long run. So.
Totally agree, totally agree. Caroline, what in your view would be that approach to fostering the connections? You know, going back to the earlier question, right? So whether it's it's a hybrid identity or it's a new form of identities, what would be the good way to forge that connections, given your experience in Mauritius, in your research in Australia, as well as your research in the US? What would be some of the takeaways that, you know, from your past experience you think would be useful, right, to forge that connections in spite of the differences towards how that identity or the complex identity is being conceptualized?
Yeah, I want to take on to the point that Farish said about, and I think the word tolerance have been given a bad name, because I think tolerance sometimes is good enough. And what I mean by this is, I think if societies, and we talk about what would make cohesive societies, if we can agree on the core values that across all our citizens we agree on, then that would be like the overarching values that allow us to go, I disagree with your practice, but I will still allow you to perform it because of our overarching value that you and I share. And that for me is one pillar of having a cohesive society, accepting as a society with difference, what are going to be those core values that we are all going to agree on, so that if, when it comes to the practice, because that's what people disagree about actually. They don't quite disagree on the abstract. They don't disagree on everyone should love each other. Of course everyone should love each other. But how do they actually do it is what they disagree about. And for that, I think that's where the idea of tolerance come in place, is to know that we've agreed as a society which is diverse that these are our core values, and I will allow you to have those concrete practices, even if I don't agree with the way that you do it. But because I value the diversity that we hold dear in our society, I will allow you to have a loudspeaker for prayers. That was a contention in Mauritius at one point, because it was close to a place where everyone, how do you call that? The word is not coming in English now, sorry. To where everyone lived. It was in a neighborhood, right? In a residential neighborhood, and there was contest about this. So it's not on the contest of abstract value of believing. People agree on that we have a right to believe in God, but it was about the concrete practice of, I don't agree because it's in the neighborhood and I want to sleep, right? And the other one says, well, I do want to pray too. So then that's where tolerance come in, right? Where do we go? Well, when we live in a diverse society, there's some negotiation that we need to do, and there's some give and take, and then we kind of agree. But I think to be able to do this, and that's where it becomes more challenging for societies that are big and super diverse, as opposed to Mauritius, is that the groundwork for bottom-up diversity has already been done in everyday life. Like, people don't live in enclaves. they talk to each other, they know the nuances of when I'm talking to this one, this is the way that I'm going to address them. Whereas in this setting, I can say this. That ability to move across spheres is a strength which becomes harder the more diverse the society is. And I think societies like Australia, who are super diverse, especially in the cities, it's really harder to do that. And maybe the talk that we need to have is, all right, yes, we're a diverse society, but what the values, I'm really strong on what are the values that will allow us to, at the concrete level, disagree, but not at the abstract level.
Thank you. We have 2 more minutes before we end the session, but I have one question here that I think both of you can answer. But before I pose the question, just give you a little bit of context on Singapore. Here in Singapore, we like to organize some of our social policies according to racial categories. Chinese, Malays, Indian, right? And of course, you know, in the midst of all of that, we inherited a legacy, right, of how we design our social policies. But, you know, as Singapore evolves, you know, a lot of things change, right? So for example, if you talk about interracial marriages, that's 1 in 4, right? So every 4 marriages, you have an interracial couple. And if you look at transnational marriage, it's even higher, it's 1 in 3. Right? So over time, I think that whole fabric change and the so-called hyper-diverse society is going to emerge. And this is a question that I'm going to ask both of you, and perhaps, you know, each of you can take 30 seconds to, you know, tell me what you think about it. Right? So quite simply, what will be a successful socially cohesive society looks like to you in a hyper-diverse society, in a complex hyper-diverse society? What would be a successful cohesive society looks like? Farish?
Maybe like a Benetton ad, but not so expensive.
Is that still around?
Yeah, you know, our generation. You know, where, like I said, people can actually disagree openly, you know, in each other's faces, and still sit down and have a drink and watch TV together after that, you know.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Caroline?
I do agree with this one, because I do think that if we can have a society where people are not afraid to talk to each other, right, when they're different or they look different, and have conversation and have the assumption that I might disagree with the person, but that's okay. And accept that difference, especially in our very politically correct world that we live in. I think it's done from a good place, but it's taken to an extreme which actually has counterintuitive effects of what it was meant to be. So if we can start bottom up and really have conversation across with an open heart, that's a good place to start.
Thank you, Caroline. I think Farish, you want to chime in on that?
Just to add, you know, I think the worst, the most emotional and violent arguments I've ever had are with my best friends. And that's why they're my best friends. And I think that we need to remember that.
Thank you so much, both speakers. I think that's a really, really fascinating exchange. We had a lot of questions, and I think we hear a lot from both speakers. Wonderful exchange. Thank you so much. Let's put our hands together and thank both distinguished speakers. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I think we've come to the end of this breakout. It's been a fascinating exchange for, you know, both speakers as well as the audience, and we hope that, you know, you can, you know, from this conversation you can take away, you know, something that's relevant for the work that you do. And again, you know, this doesn't end here today, all right? So feel free to send us your feedback and, you know, drop us a comment, and, you know, if you have anything you'd like to tell us or tell both speakers, let us know. All right. So thank you so much again for having you here, and I wish you have a wonderful evening. And we'll see you again tomorrow. Thank you.